Over the past decade, people began releasing huge numbers of wasps on Christmas Island in the Indian Ocean. And not just any kind, but a species that preys on the insects living there. Like in a horror movie, these flying creatures lay their larvae right inside a chosen victim, and then another wasp emerges from it, and the population keeps growing. The craziest thing is that Christmas Island's actually under Australia's control. Yes, that very same country that once brought in loads of animals that ended up causing ecological chaos. Toads, foxes, rabbits. You know the story. Naturally, people reacted fast. Many locals warned that this could trigger another ecosystem collapse. Almost every animal on this tiny patch of land is now at risk. Still, they haven't stopped releasing wasps and won't stop anytime soon. What for? You're about to find out. Paradise Lost. Before humans arrived, Christmas Island looked like a tiny planet living by its own rules. There was none of the usual balance we know: birds, insects, plants. The main architect and gardener of the island was a local endemic, the red crab. Tens of millions of crabs literally shaped the whole ecosystem. Crabs picked up every fallen twig and leaf, turning the forest into a perfectly clean park. No rotting piles, not even the remains of their own kind. No heaps of moss. Everything quickly broken down and returned to the soil. Unlike in other tropical regions where this work is done by hundreds of species of beetles, ants, and termites, here the role of nature's cleaners was carried out almost entirely by a single species. The red crabs worked like a giant living vacuum cleaner, and that's exactly why the island's soil was loose, airy, and fertile. But their job didn't end there. The red crabs also stopped many plants from spreading, keeping their forest in a state of dynamic balance. Without their non-stop cleaning, the island would have quickly been smothered under a dense carpet of leaves, where roots would suffocate and young shoots wouldn't be able to reach the light. In other words, the red crabs literally carried the whole forest on their shoulders, like little atlases. Even the island's climate, in a way, depended on them. They loosened the soil, letting moisture and oxygen seep through, and that directly affected humidity and tree growth. The most spectacular event that unfolded on the island every year was the mass crab migration. When the rains began, millions of these creatures left the forest and rushed to the ocean to lay their eggs. It looked like a stream of living lava, glowing red as it poured through forests, down slopes, and across any terrain in its path. For the local birds, it was a real feast. For other predators too. Yet, crab numbers still stayed huge, and the ecosystem stayed stable. That's how it went for thousands of years, until the day humans set foot on the island. People arrived here fairly late in the 19th century, but as so often happens, they brought along stowaways that had nothing to do with the natural ecosystem. One such unwanted visitor was the yellow crazy ant. They were brought in by accident, most likely with a ship's cargo, and in their new home, they got something they'd never had back where they came from: zero natural enemies. Their colonies began to grow to monstrous sizes. The ants even formed super colonies, stretching over dozens of acres and moved in dense swarms through the forest. And that's when the tragedy for the red crabs began. You'd think, what harm could a tiny ant possibly do to a crab? But as history shows, it's often these small and unnoticeable creatures that deal the most devastating blows. The ants swarmed the crabs, sprayed acid into their eyes and joints, paralyzing and killing them in massive numbers. For a crab that was used to being the king of the forest, such attacks were a death sentence. Millions of them died, and little by little, the crabs began to vanish from parts of the island. And as they disappeared, the forest itself started to change. Leaves no longer got cleared away. They began piling up on the ground. Mosses and molds got their chance to spread into new areas. The plants the crabs once kept under control started growing unchecked, pushing out rarer species. The balance built up over thousands of years literally crumbled before people's eyes. The secret of the crazy ants. The yellow crazy ants on Christmas Island don't wipe out the red crabs because they want to eat them. Their strategy is completely different. They kill for control over space. In their logic, the territory must be clean, free of large animals that get in the way of building super colonies. They don't see crabs as prey, but as obstacles. Two restless neighbors that dig soil, move leaves, and break the usual order. To free up land for their empire, the ants simply push the crabs out of the ecosystem. And in this endless purge, their true power is revealed. The crab was the guardian of the island. Millions of them stirred up the soil, made it alive, spread seeds, and kept the forest in balance. But for the ants, that activity looked like a threat to their stability. They need flat, controlled land where nothing disturbs the workers' routes or bothers their colonies, so the crabs automatically turn into enemies. When millions of ants settle in one place, everything around slowly stops being diverse. What's left is only their endless army and empty space. So what do they eat then? Humans had a hand in this too without realizing it. They created all the right conditions for the ants on Christmas Island by introducing the yellow lac scale. Yes, those tiny, unremarkable dots on branches and stems are insects, the yellow lac scales. But the ants don't care about appearances. What matters is that the insect releases sweet honeydew. And that honeydew is the main source of nutrition for the yellow crazy ant. It's so important, in fact, that ants and scales formed a symbiosis. The first produce the honeydew, the second guard their food generators from predators and carry them to new plants. You could say that on this small patch of land, the crazy ant's only hope lies with the yellow lac scale. And in the end, these insects were the ones that betrayed the little invasive ants. Scientists realized the scales are the key to reducing the ant population that wiped out the crabs on Christmas Island. Stinging weapon. Scientists launched an operation that looked more like a carefully planned special mission than routine conservation work. Resting on the coin is a tiny, almost invisible creature, the microscopic wasp, Tacardiophagous somervillei. This wasp became the main player in a biological campaign aimed at changing the balance of forces on the island. The story began in labs thousands of miles away from Christmas Island. There, entomologists spent years studying the wasp's life cycle and behavior. This isn't the kind of wasp that buzzes around a summer plum. Its size is under 0.04 inches. It lives quietly, but strikes with accuracy. What most impressed the researchers was its narrow specialization. The wasp is designed to target specifically the yellow lac scale on Christmas Island and nothing else. Before moving the wasps to the island, they were tested under strict quarantine. Everything was checked, whether it might attack local insects or accidentally start reproducing on another host. Only once it was cleared that its focus was entirely on the yellow lac scale did the scientists give the go-ahead. The wasps were shipped to the island in batches inside small containers, handled with the same care as if they were rare gemstones. Release sites weren't chosen randomly, and areas where scale colonies were especially dense. Scientists would walk into the thickets, open the containers, and the tiny wasps would quietly vanish into the greenery. No sound, no fuss, only the faintest movement in the air. And then came the most fascinating part, the wasp's invisible work. The female of this flying insect, having found a colony of lac insects, picks out a suitable one and injects an egg into it with its thread-like ovipositor. This takes just a split second. The wasp larva develops inside the insect's body, feeding on its internal resources, and in the end, the food generator for the crazy ant dies. It all happens quietly. On the outside, the insect shows no dramatic change. Inside, though, a gradual, precise, and irreversible process begins. After some time, a grown wasp emerges from the insect's body. It gnaws a tiny hole through the shell, neat, round, as if made by a miniature drill. These holes later serve as proof for scientists that the wasps have done their job. The new adults immediately scatter across nearby branches, search out fresh hosts, and keep the cycle going. To make the process continuous, the scientists carried out not just one, but a whole series of releases. Step by step, a stable population of this microscopic army took hold on the island. In field journals, scientists logged the release points, the weather, the density of the insects, everything needed to track how this new force spread across the land. Did it work? When scientists first released the microscopic wasp on Christmas Island, there was a quiet sense of triumph in the air. The ideas seemed almost perfect, a natural mechanism versus a natural process. No poisons, no mechanical interference, just a tiny parasitoid capable of slipping into the ecosystem and subtly changing its dynamics. But not everyone views this story with enthusiasm. From the very start, the project had its opponents. Their main argument was simple. Biological methods aren't an on-off switch you can flick and forget. They set off a chain of consequences, often stretched over time and hard to predict. Intervening with a living organism, especially an invasive one, even if carefully tested, always carries an element of uncertainty. The first thing that raises doubts among critics is the question of control. A wasp can't read instructions. Once released, it lives by its own rules, not the scientist's plan. Yes, in quarantine, it showed a narrow specialization, but behavior in an artificial environment doesn't always match behavior in the wild. Some experts recall past cases where biological weapons had unexpected effects, one species pushing out another, switching to unforeseen hosts, or simply throwing the balance off. Let's not forget, this is happening in Australia, so doubts like these will always be around. Too many times on that vast continent, non-native species were brought in with the best intentions, only to cause a collapse. The most striking example is, of course, the cane toad, which arrived on Australia's sugarcane farms to get rid of pests, but ended up becoming one of the country's worst invasive species ever. The second reason for criticizing the program has to do with long-term monitoring. The project was designed as multi-stage and long-term, but skeptics worry that over time, attention and funding may dry up. The wasp, however, will stay. Who'll be keeping track of how its population behaves in 10 or 20 years? What if it starts interacting with other insects or takes over some niche no one had thought about? Some ecologists cautiously note that even the most narrowly specialized parasitoid can have indirect effects. For instance, reducing the number of yellow lax scales could affect species that depend on their presence, not directly, but through subtle food chain or behavioral links. An ecosystem's a tricky thing, and removing one piece can easily wreck the whole system. Critics also ask, how sustainable will the effect be? If the wasp can't maintain its numbers at the right level, the project may turn out to be just a temporary fix, one that constantly needs reinforcement. On the other hand, if the population grows too much, a new imbalance could emerge. Of course, nobody forgot about ethics either. Should people really be moving some species around just to control others? Where's the line between restoring ecosystems and redesigning living systems according to our own script? For some, this project is an example of responsible intervention backed by scientific evidence. For others, it's just another chapter in the long history of humans trying to fix nature, not always with predictable outcomes. What matters is that critics aren't calling to abandon the biological method itself. Their view is slightly different. They want more attention to risks, transparency in monitoring plans, and readiness to acknowledge unforeseen consequences. They remind us bringing a species into an ecosystem isn't like putting up a fence or turning on a pump. It's an action with its own inherent nature and ripple effects. Still, the WASP project on Christmas Island is moving ahead. And what else really, if the earlier ways of fighting off invasive ants were much worse? Pointless struggle. Before tiny wasps appeared on Christmas Island, more familiar methods were used. This was a story about helicopters, bags of bait, and people who combed the forest step by step, trying to outsmart millions of insects. For a long time, the most powerful tool was a fipronil-based insecticide, a chemical that doesn't strike immediately but spreads via social transfer. An ant takes the bait, carries it back to the nest, and the poison spreads through the entire colony. From the early 2000s, scientists and national park staff had put together a massive plan. Huge stretches of forest were blanketed with bait literally from the air by helicopters. Tons of pellets were scattered over the green canopy, trying to reach even the hardest-to-get spots. From the ground, it looked like a calm tropical forest, but from above, it looked like a war theater. Precise flight lines, drop coordinates, breaks between rains. Where helicopters couldn't manage, people stepped in. Teams of people with bait containers slowly moved through the undergrowth, placing pellets by hand. The work was meticulous. To cover colonies spread over miles, they had to account for ant behavior, their routes, and even the lay of the land. For some time, the strategy worked like a charm. After spreading the bait everywhere, ant numbers plunged and super colonies collapsed. But the effect didn't last. The ants returned from untouched spots like water finding its way through a tiny crack. To keep the effect, treatments had to be done again and again. In certain areas, baits with boron compounds were tested, less harmful to other wildlife. They were placed in special containers carefully so as not to bother other animals. These methods also worked, but were time-consuming and not practical for large areas. Slowly, it became obvious. Chemical methods, no matter how precise, are like a fire hose. They douse the fire quickly, but don't solve the problem long-term. The island's forest is complex and hard to access, and the ants are tough and mobile. Every round of treatment required coordination, logistics, and money. And of course, people also had complaints about these methods. The main source of concern was simple: chemicals. Local fishermen and residents of coastal villages wondered, where would these substances end up after the rain? Could they get into the streams and coastal waters? And might crabs and other creatures, which are more than just wildlife to the island but part of daily life, be affected? Some people worried about the possible effects of the insecticide on pets, bees, and even gathering wild foods in the forest. Some farmers feared that the treatment might affect their small farms. In short, you can't please everyone, so scientists started looking not for what would make some people happy, but for what would really work in the long term. Saving the island. When people on Christmas Island started talking about bringing in wasps, all eyes were on the red crabs. But changes were happening across the island. The yellow crazy ants had spent over 20 years bending the island's life to their will, and the weakening of their army gives room to those long kept in the shadows. Coconut crabs aren't just crabs, they're nearly mythical creatures. Enormous, strong, climbing trees, cracking coconuts, feeling like the rulers of the forest. But even they couldn't hold up. In the super colony zones where ant densities hit 1,000 per 10 square feet, coconut crabs simply disappeared. The ants swarmed them, burned their soft parts with acid, and blocked their migration paths. After the first chemical treatments in 2009 to 2010, researchers saw as soon as the ants pulled back, the crabs started returning. Biocontrol with wasps promises a steady decrease in ant numbers, not a one-off strike. That means coconut crabs have a shot at taking back the forests that were once theirs. Blue crabs, terrestrial hermit crabs, and small burrowing crabs. All of them have retreated from the coastal areas turned into acidic fields by ants in recent years. When the pressure lets up, these areas will become suitable again for breeding and burrow building. And this isn't just about species coming back, but about restoring many functions, loosening soil, breaking down leaf litter, and shaping micro-landscapes. Down below, under the leaf layer, changes will start too. Of the 40 local ant species in the super colony zones, only 2 survive. The rest, along with beetles, isopods, millipedes, and soil insects, were pushed out. After the invaders' numbers dropped in chemically treated areas, scientists recorded a rapid return of soil communities. These quiet workers aren't visible to people, but they're the ones keeping the forest breathing, processing organic matter, and aerating the soil. Wasps should be just as effective as insecticides. Those living higher will win too, birds and reptiles. Abbott's boobies, rare ground-nesting seabirds, have lost entire clutches before. Ants attacked eggs and chicks, and some colonies were wiped out entirely. If the pressure exerted by ants weakens, these nesting areas can be reclaimed. Endemic skinks will feel better too. Ants attacked juveniles and destroyed their shelters. And where the ant colony shrank, skinks returned quickly. What not to do? Australia, of course, knows what wrong biocontrol looks like, but there are cases from other countries that also show biocontrol can always backfire. In the early 1900s, forests in the eastern U.S. were getting thinned out by the gluttonous spongy moth, which had been brought to Massachusetts from Europe at the end of the 19th century. Local trees, unprepared for such attacks, were losing their leaves faster than people could restore them. The scientific community, driven by the optimism of the taming nature era, thought the solution is biocontrol. All they had to do was find the moth's natural enemy back in Europe and bring it to America. It all seemed perfectly reasonable. In 1906, the taconid fly arrived in the country. It looked like an ordinary gray fly, nothing special, but inside it hid a complex parasitic mechanism. The female would find a caterpillar, pierce its body, and inject a larva inside. It started its journey as a tiny passenger and ended as a killer. It fed on internal tissues until the caterpillar died. In Europe, this system was balanced. The fly had to deal with parasites, predators, and climate limits, but in North America, where there were no such checks, it ran unchecked. The problem wasn't just that the fly felt way too comfortable. Even worse, it wasn't a narrow specialist at all. Unlike many parasitoids, it didn't stick to one host. Its drive to reproduce went beyond all limits. It targeted over 200 insect species. Butterflies, moths, some beetles, and sawflies suddenly became an all-you-can-eat buffet for the fly larva. The spongy moth was just one item on a huge menu. The local giant silk moths suffered the most, large, beautiful moths that had been part of these ecosystems for centuries. The Luna moth, Cecropia moth, Polyphemus moth, species whose caterpillars once made it through the season unscathed, now suddenly started dying en masse. In some areas of New England, the taconid fly has become their leading cause of death, even surpassing its impact on the spongy moth. Researchers at the University of Massachusetts, including David Boatner and Joseph Elkington, conducted a series of experiments in the late 20th century. They placed certain caterpillars in the forest and tracked how many survived attacks by flies. The results were staggering. In some samples, parasitism rates reached 80 to 100%. It turned out that the flies survived the winter not thanks to the moths, but by switching to other species. Flies produce several generations per year, while moths have only one. This meant that, to survive, the fly had to consistently and extensively use alternative hosts. What began as a rescue operation turned into a quiet ecological disaster. While the fly did some damage to moths, the greater harm was to the local wildlife. Over a century, the fly became established in forests of the eastern United States, becoming an invisible yet persistent predator that could not be eradicated. Another example involves the giant African snail, which multiplied rapidly and caused serious damage to agriculture on Pacific Islands. To control its population, authorities introduced the New Guinea flatworm, known for its voracious appetite for mollusks. At first, its arrival was met with cautious optimism. Researchers noted that the flatworm readily devoured young, giant African snails and displayed impressive appetites in lab conditions. In practice, however, it turned out that in the wild, the flatworm simply switched to more accessible and slower prey. Local snails, many of which inhabit limited ranges and cannot burrow deeply into the soil. Rare species of small endemic mollusks on the islands of French Polynesia and Micronesia suffered the most. There, the worm literally raked through the forest floor, wiping out populations that previously had no serious natural predators. To make things worse, the flatworm quickly adapted to new conditions and spread easily along with soil, plants, and garden tools. It can survive in climates ranging from the tropics to more temperate regions, making control nearly impossible. Unlike predatory rosy wolf snail, which was also introduced to manage the African invasive herbivore and could be somewhat controlled, the flatworm is secretive, nocturnal, and extremely resilient. Today, the species is listed among the 100 most dangerous invasive species by the International Union for Conservation of Nature. On many islands, it's become a primary cause of the disappearance of entire snail genera, and restoring them is often impossible. Their slow life cycles cannot withstand such pressure, so the attempt to restore balance quietly turned into an ecological disaster. One link was removed from the chain only to be replaced by another, far more destructive. People love to destroy. In reality, even if you rule out every scenario where biocontrol might go wrong, like the examples mentioned earlier, Christmas Island could still face problems because humans need resources. Phosphates, in particular, are at the heart of the island's modern history. Back in 1899, when the first geologists discovered a thick layer of white rock on the plateau, events quickly followed the familiar colonial pattern. Companies, workers, and machinery soon arrived. By the early 20th century, the island had become one huge quarry. Phosphates were shipped off to plantations and farms in Australia and Asia, leaving behind pits, cleared forests, and increasingly depleted soil. Phosphate extraction reached its height in the mid-20th century, with hundreds of thousands of tons exported every year. From the 1940s to the 1980s, the island was essentially stripped layer by layer. Phosphates were scraped from the surface without digging deep, like removing the crust of a pie. After the old state-owned mine closed in 1987, it seemed that this era had come to an end. But soon, a private company, Phosphate Resources Limited, stepped in, and the phosphate conveyor started running again. Today, mining is somewhat more organized, but the process remains largely the same. According to official reports from the Australian Geological Survey, around 600,000 tons of phosphate ore have been exported from the island in recent years. Equipment operates on previously mined sites, processing and loading happen through the port, and exports continue to target fertilizer markets. Phosphates remain the island's main economic driver, supporting jobs and the budget. Yet there is a crucial point. Phosphate reserves are dwindling. The easily accessible, rich deposits of the past are gone. Now the focus is on expanding mining into areas where tropical forests and habitats of rare species still exist. The companies applied for new licenses, and plans for clearing additional land are under discussion. Each proposed expansion undergoes scrutiny under the Biodiversity Conservation Act, and debates over these projects are growing increasingly heated. Environmentalists and some local people warn that expanding mining operations could erase all the progress made in controlling the yellow crazy ants. Let's assume that the micro-wasp program works perfectly and the ants disappear, allowing the forest to recover. But at the same time, excavators will still strip the topsoil, build roads, and clear new mining areas. This kind of activity fragments habitats, and simplifying ecosystems is detrimental to nature. The island has already experienced a period when industry outpaced nature. The result is deforested plateaus, lost habitats, and a long trail of environmental problems. That history could repeat on a larger scale. No matter how successful biological control may be, it won't protect the island from heavy machinery. This is perhaps the weakest point of the current strategy. The focus is on restoring nature, yet underneath the island, plans are already in motion to remove another layer of soil.